The dwarf masked owl, a rare migratory bird of prey. This looks like a little descriptive clause. Normally makes its winter home on the Baja Peninsula, where it nests in the spiny cactus. In fact, there are no other suitable other meaning. It's referring to this here, so no other suitable nesting sites. I think we can color code it safely to say that spiny cactus equals suitable nesting sites for the dwarf masked owl on the Baja Peninsula. This is the only one. But a blight last spring destroyed all of the spiny cacti on the Baja Peninsula and thus all of the suitable nesting sites. So unless steps are taken to reestablish the spiny cactus population, i.e. the suitable nesting sites, the dwarf masked owl will not make its home on the Baja Peninsula this winter, which, by the way, is the meat of our main conclusion here. So the argument depends on assuming which of the following. This is a necessary assumption question, and the argument has a gap here that we as the reader must bridge ourselves. We must assume this for the argument for it to remain invulnerable to criticism. If we don't make this assumption, then the argument is vulnerable to criticism. Let's see which of these answer choices indicates that assumption that this argument requires us to make. No birds of prey other than the dwarf masked owl nest in the spiny cactus. Does the argument need us to consider any other bird than the dwarf masked owl? I don't think so. We don't talk about anything else in the stimulus. So I think we can safely discount A. B, if the Baja Peninsula contains spiny cacti, then the dwarf masked owl makes its winter home there. This is saying, okay, just the mere presence of cacti is sufficient to produce the outcome of the dwarf masked owl making the Baja Peninsula its winter home. This is pretty strong. The argument doesn't need us to make this assumption to function. Generally, we're looking for a weaker kind of answer than this for necessary assumption questions. If this were a sufficient assumption question, then this might be a strong contender. But it's also falsifiable for what it's worth. Consider like an influx of predators to the Baja Peninsula that would deter the birds from wanting to make it the winter home. This is, even if the spiny cacti exist, great, we've reestablished them. There could be other factors that would make the owls not want to live here. So either way, B doesn't really fit our application. C, on occasion, the dwarf masked owl has been known to make its winter home far from its normal migratory route. Okay, cool. I think what LSAC is trying to do here is to get you to key into this word migratory that was here in the descriptive clause. It's kind of a cheap trick, but some people may say, oh, right, I'm putting 2 and 2 together. This is the right answer, moving on. But don't fall for cheap tricks. We're not talking about migration at all. That's not a factor of this stimulus. So C is also irrelevant to what we are having to consider here. The dwarf masked owl will not make its winter home on the Baja Peninsula only if that region contains no spiny cacti. Again, D and B are kind of suspiciously strong for a necessary assumption question. So what this is saying is the absence of spiny cacti is the only thing that could deter the birds from wanting to stay here for the winter. Okay, the argument doesn't require us to make that assumption. And also, again, consider predators. This is a situation where there are other factors that could make the birds not. What if there's no food? You know what I mean? There are other things that could make the birds not want to stay here than just the absence of the spiny cacti. E, suitable nesting sites must be present where the dwarf masked owl makes its winter home. Okay. Does the argument need us to assume that for the bird to make its winter home on the Baja Peninsula, there's got to be some kind of nesting site? Let's take a look at what it's actually trying to say. It's saying, hey, this kind of bird in this place only has one place to nest. But all of those nesting places were destroyed. So unless we put nesting places back, it's not going to make its home here. The argument has nesting places and home, and we have to jump from one bubble to the other. We can only do that by making an assumption. I don't think the argument deserves that assumption, and thus it depends on us assuming that suitable nesting sites must be present where the dwarf masked owl makes its winter home. Consider, what if they could just grab a tarp and a sleeping bag and set up shop on the Baja Peninsula for the winter and make it through? What if they could make their home on this place without the spiny cacti? If that was the case, then this argument would fall apart. E, if assumed, inoculates the argument from that criticism, and thus E is the right answer to this necessary assumption question. All right, let's take a look at this second question here. Only a very small percentage of people from the service professions ever become board members of the 600 largest North American corporations. This shows this phenomena, the very fact that only a small percentage of people from these professions ever become board members of these corporations. That shows that people from the service professions are underrepresented in the most important corporate boardrooms in North America. Worth noting, this is kind of a sneaky thing to do, to say that the 600 largest are equivalent to the most important. I don't think it's that big of a leap, but it is worth noting, considering that we are dealing with a flaw question. Is this the flaw, or is there something more egregious going on? Let's start with A. 600 is too small a sample on which to base so sweeping a conclusion about the representation of people from the service professions. Is this a matter of sample size? I think 600 seems like a decent sample size to me, especially considering that we don't really know how many corporations there are in America. We don't really have a concept of scale. 600 seems sufficient. Sample size is the correct answer to some flaw questions, and I think the only reason they included it here is just because maybe if you've chosen that in the past, it would feel good to see here, and you might click it and move on. But that's kind of a cheap trick, and I'd urge you not to fall for it. Let's see. B, the percentage of people from the service professions who serve on the boards of the 600 largest North American corporations reveals little about the percentage of the members of these boards who are from the service professions. This is a wordy, obtuse, and pretty gaslighty way to say something that is actually kind of simple in principle. So let's break down what it's actually saying. So the argument itself is saying that only a very small percentage of people who have been service workers. I mean, let's consider how many service workers there are in America, right? Maybe 2 million. There could be more, there could be less. That's not the point. Only a very small percentage of that 2 million go on to become board members, right? How many slots are there on the boards of these corporations? Say 600, maybe there are 10 board members per corporation. That means there are only 600 or 6,000 slots to fill, 12,000 shoes. So compared to the pool of 2 million service workers, even if every single one of the board members was a service worker, it would still be a very small percentage of people from the service professions. What this is trying to say is just because that's a small drop from the pond of service workers, it still gives us nothing to assess the composition, the percentage of people on the board that are from the service industry. So this doesn't show that at all, and that's what B is trying to say. But the LSAT is extremely good at making the correct answer seem obtuse and exhausting to read. So don't let it bully you. Moving on to C, let's see why C is wrong. It is a mistake to take the 600 largest North American corporations to be typical of corporate boardrooms generally. So I think we're talking about a pretty specific subsect of corporations here. We're talking about the 600 largest and or the most important corporate boardrooms. We're not talking about all of them. And so it doesn't really matter if these 600 are indicative of trends in corporate boardrooms as a whole. It is relevant to smaller corporations whether the largest corporations in North America would agree to have significant numbers of workers from the service professions on the boards of the largest corporations. Is this a matter of hiring preferences? Furthermore, I mean, it's kind of a two-pronged thing. We're not really concerned about the attitudes of the people designating these board members, and furthermore, we're not concerned about smaller corporations at all. I mean, we pretty specifically indicated that we're talking about the 600 largest and the most important corporate boardrooms. And unless you really wanted to die on the hill that the most important corporate boardrooms in America are the smallest ones, then I think we can safely discount D as being irrelevant. because the LSAT is not a place to die in hills. It's a place to look at the stimulus and look at the questions. Moving on to E, the presence of people from the service professions on a corporate board does not necessarily imply that the corporation will be more socially responsible than it has been in the past. Okay, this sounded plausible or convincing enough until socially responsible hit the field, and that's just not what we're talking about at all. I mean, it doesn't matter if these guys are, dumping thousands of gallons of toxic waste into natural resources. I mean, they could be doing that. That's fine or horrible, but it's not the point, because we're talking about service workers being underrepresented based on this, strange interaction here that doesn't quite mesh. This is not the flaw, and it's not even what we're talking about. So we'll circle back to B. Like I said, even if every single one of the board members was from the service industry, this still doesn't make sense, because they would still represent a small percentage of service workers as a whole. So B is our flaw in the answer to this question.